Big Shaq walks into an elite jewelry store to pick up his one-of-a-kind timepiece, only to be accused of stealing it in front of the world. But this isn't about a watch. It's about power, control, and a hidden enemy pulling the strings. As his empire hangs in the balance, Shaq must outplay his rivals, expose the conspiracy, and flip the game before it's too late. Because in a war of reputation, the truth isn't enough. Only domination guarantees survival. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The scent of polished mahogany and expensive cologne filled the air as Big Shaq stepped into Vanguard Jewelers, one of the most prestigious luxury watch retailers in New York City. Every surface gleamed under soft, strategically placed lighting, reflecting the exclusivity of a store that catered to only the world's wealthiest elite. Shaq moved with purpose, his tailored black suit fitting his frame perfectly, exuding quiet power. He wasn't just a billionaire entrepreneur, he was a man who never lost control. And today was no different. He had come for one reason, to collect his custom-commissioned timepiece, a one-of-a-kind Vanguard Orion, designed exclusively for him. Handcrafted in Switzerland, encrusted with rare blue sapphires, the watch wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement. A uniformed sales associate, a man in his late 30s with neatly combed brown hair, immediately straightened at the sight of Shaq. His expression was polite, but his posture was too stiff, his smile too rehearsed. "Mr. Hunter," the man greeted, voice smooth but lacking the warmth usually reserved for high-profile clients. "We've been expecting you." Shaq arched a brow but said nothing. He was escorted to a private VIP lounge within the store, a sleek, glass-walled room with velvet seating and a single display case sitting on a polished marble pedestal. Inside the case, resting on a black silk cushion, was the Vanguard Orion. Perfection. The moment the case was unlocked, Shaq reached for the watch, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The cool platinum, the smooth sapphire face, exactly as he had ordered. No need for small talk, no need for hesitation. He slid the watch onto his wrist, admiring the flawless craftsmanship. Then, with his usual efficiency, he turned and headed toward the exit. And that's when it happened. The moment he stepped past the invisible security barrier, a piercing alarm shattered the silence. Every head in the store turned. Shaq froze. A fraction of a second later, two security guards appeared from nowhere, moving swiftly, cutting off his path to the door. The air shifted. Something wasn't right. Shaq didn't react immediately. He didn't need to. Years of navigating high-stakes negotiations had trained him to recognize when a power play was unfolding. And right now, he was in the middle of one. Behind the guards, a man in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit emerged from the inner offices. His silver cufflinks glinted under the store lights as he approached with an air of controlled authority. Grayson Holt, store manager. A man who had built a reputation for discretion. The kind of person who handled transactions worth millions without ever flinching. But as he stopped a few feet from Shaq, his expression was unreadable. "Mr. Hunter," Holt said smoothly, hands clasped behind his back. "I'm afraid we have a problem." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his calm, controlled gaze never wavering. "Do we?" Holt didn't blink. "Yes, that watch on your wrist hasn't been paid for." Silence. A long, charged pause filled the space between them. Shaq's eyes narrowed, his mind processing 1,000 calculations at once. The watch hadn't been paid for? Impossible. His assistant had wired the full payment weeks ago. The order had been confirmed. His team had double-checked every detail. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. "Try again," Shaq said, his voice steady, but edged with quiet warning. Holt exhaled, as if regretful. "I wish I could. But according to our system, the funds for that purchase were reversed. The watch remains property of Vanguard Jewelers." Shaq's jaw tensed just slightly, a flicker of irritation flashing behind his sharp gaze. "You're saying I stole my own watch?" Holt's silence was answer enough. The guards remained in place, their stance unwavering. The store's entire staff seemed frozen, watching the situation unfold. Some with nervous expressions, others with deliberate neutrality, as if they had been prepped for this moment. Shaq's heartbeat remained steady, but inside, the calculation shifted. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a move. But whose? The people in the store weren't acting like this was some random incident. The guards weren't confused. They were waiting. The employees weren't shocked. They were watching. And Holt? Holt was too calm, too prepared. Shaq could feel it in his gut. This wasn't about a watch. This was about him. A lesser man would have demanded proof, raised his voice, called his lawyer. Shaq did none of those things. Instead, he took a slow step forward, and even though the guards didn't move, the tension in the air spiked. "Holt," Shaq said, voice dangerously smooth. "You've been in this business a long time. Long enough to know when someone's pulling a stunt." Holt didn't flinch. "I only follow store policy." Shaq let the silence stretch, watching Holt. Watching the minute twitch in his jaw, the slight shift in his stance. He was lying. But more than that, he was stalling. Why? Shaq's instincts sharpened. There was something bigger at play here, something behind the scenes. And the way Holt was acting? He wasn't in control. Someone else was pulling the strings. The question was, who? And why? Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't need to check it to know who it was. His assistant, his team, his people already moving. Because if someone thought they could box him into a corner, turn him into a pawn in their game, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Shaq exhaled once, then offered a slow, knowing smirk. They wanted him to react, to lose control. So instead, he stepped back and let the game begin. The tension in the room thickened like a slow-moving storm, silent but electric, charged with an unspoken threat that hung in the air between Big Shaq and Grayson Holt. The jewelry store's opulent surroundings, with its gleaming marble floors and soft ambient lighting, no longer felt like a place of luxury. It felt like a stage. And Shaq was the main act in a performance he never agreed to join. Holt stood just a few feet away, perfectly composed, immaculately dressed, the kind of man who exuded confidence not because he was powerful, but because he had been given power, by someone else. His navy blue suit was crisp, tailored to perfection, his silver cufflinks gleaming under the light as he adjusted his sleeve with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't nervous. That was the most telling part. Shaq kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already working at a relentless pace, calculating, analyzing, peeling back the layers of this setup. His legal team was already moving, making calls, pulling transaction records. Yet Holt didn't seem concerned, and that alone told Shaq one undeniable truth. This wasn't about the watch. This was about him. Holt clasped his hands behind his back, his voice smooth, measured. "Mr. Hunter, I understand your frustration. But the fact remains. Our records show that this watch was never fully paid for. The funds were reversed, and as of now, it belongs to Vanguard Jewelers." Shaq met Holt's gaze with unwavering intensity, his expression unreadable. "And yet, somehow, you didn't mention that before I walked in here, before I put it on my wrist and made my exit. Convenient, don't you think?" A flicker of something crossed Holt's face. Not fear, but recognition. He knew Shaq wasn't going to be an easy target. That only made this more interesting. Security remained stationed by the exit, their presence a silent warning. They weren't moving toward him, but they weren't stepping aside either. A blockade, not an enforcement. The entire store was still. Employees were pretending to busy themselves, but Shaq could feel their stolen glances, the quiet tension in their movements. They weren't just witnessing an incident, they were watching something orchestrated. Then came the sound. A distant shuffle, followed by the faintest hum of voices outside. Shaq didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. The media was here. Holt tilted his head slightly, as if he had just confirmed a checkmate move. "This is an unfortunate situation, Mr. Hunter, but it doesn't have to escalate. If we could settle this quietly, I'm sure we can avoid unnecessary attention." Shaq let a slow smirk cross his lips, the first real expression he had shown since this began. "Unnecessary attention?" He gestured vaguely toward the entrance. "You made sure they were here before I even walked in, Holt. Don't insult my intelligence." For the first time, The store manager's mask cracked. Not much, just a fraction of a second. A single misstep in an otherwise flawless act. Shaq had him. The tension in the room thickened like a slow-moving storm, silent but electric, charged with an unspoken threat that hung in the air between Big Shaq and Grayson Holt. The jewelry store's opulent surroundings, with its gleaming marble floors and soft ambient lighting, no longer felt like a place of luxury. It felt like a stage, and Shaq was the main act in a performance he never agreed to join. Holt stood just a few feet away, perfectly composed, immaculately dressed, the kind of man who exuded confidence not because he was powerful, but because he had been given power by someone else. His navy blue suit was crisp, tailored to perfection, his silver cufflinks gleaming under the light as he adjusted his sleeve with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't nervous. That was the most telling part. Shaq kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already working at a relentless pace, calculating, analyzing, peeling back the layers of this setup. His legal team was already moving, making calls, pulling transaction records. Yet Holt didn't seem concerned, and that alone told Shaq one undeniable truth. This wasn't about the watch. This was about him. Holt clasped his hands behind his back, his voice smooth, measured. "Mr. Hunter, I understand your frustration, but the fact remains, our records show that this watch was never fully paid for. The funds were reversed, and as of now, it belongs to Vanguard Jewelers." Shaq met Holt's gaze with unwavering intensity, his expression unreadable. "And yet somehow you didn't mention that before I walked in here, before I put it on my wrist and made my exit. Convenient, don't you think?" A flicker of something crossed Holt's face. Not fear, but recognition. He knew Shaq wasn't going to be an easy target. That only made this more interesting. Security remained stationed by the exit, their presence a silent warning. They weren't moving toward him, but they weren't stepping aside either. A blockade, not an enforcement. The entire store was still. Employees were pretending to busy themselves, but Shaq could feel their stolen glances, the quiet tension in their movements. They weren't just witnessing an incident. They were watching something orchestrated. Then came the sound. A distant shuffle, followed by the faintest hum of voices outside. Shaq didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. The media was here. Holt tilted his head slightly, as if he had just confirmed a checkmate move. "This is an unfortunate situation, Mr. Hunter, but it doesn't have to escalate. If we could settle this quietly, I'm sure we can avoid unnecessary attention." Shaq let a slow smirk cross his lips, the first real expression he had shown since this began. "Unnecessary attention?" He gestured vaguely toward the entrance. "You made sure they were here before I even walked in, Holt. Don't insult my intelligence." For the first time, the store manager's mask cracked. Not much, just a fraction of a second, a single misstep in an otherwise flawless act. Shaq had him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, not even a power move to force some ridiculous settlement out of him. This was about spectacle, public humiliation, a controlled takedown. But the question still remained. Who was really pulling the strings? Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he knew without looking that his legal team was already in play. He didn't need to check his messages to know what they would say. His transaction records were solid. The money had gone through, which meant someone had manually reversed it. A slow, simmering heat settled deep in Shaq's chest. Not anger, but something far more dangerous. Certainty. He turned back to Holt, who was waiting, still composed, still measured. "You think you're in control of this?" Shaq said, voice low, steady. "You think because you have cameras, because you have security, because you have the media waiting outside for a headline, you've won." He stepped forward just slightly, just enough to make Holt shift his weight, a microsecond of discomfort. Shaq caught it, stored it away. Another weakness. "I don't need to be in control," Holt replied coolly. "I just need to follow the facts. And the fact is, that watch doesn't belong to you." Shaq exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. "You know what's funny about facts, Holt? They have a way of changing when the wrong people start looking into them." For a split second, there it was, the briefest flicker of uncertainty in Holt's otherwise controlled expression. Shaq tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and placed it face up on the nearest glass counter. On the screen, a live security feed played. Vanguard Jewelers' private transaction logs. Shaq didn't need to say a word. The tension in the air shifted, cracked, deepened. Holt's expression hardened, but his shoulders stiffened just slightly. The first real sign of a man who was feeling his grip loosen. "You had this set up before I even walked in here," Shaq continued, voice even. "And whoever's backing you thought they were smart enough to cover their tracks. But you know what's even smarter?" He gestured to the screen. "Having a team that knows how to find the things you tried to erase." Silence. A silence so thick, so charged, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Holt swallowed, barely perceptible, but Shaq saw it. "You don't want to do this," Holt said finally, his voice quieter now, controlled but missing that previous arrogance. "You don't want to make enemies you can't see." Shaq let the words settle, weighing them, dissecting them. Holt wasn't speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for someone else, and that someone had just made a mistake. Shaq reached for his phone, sliding it back into his pocket. Then, with a slow, measured movement, he unfastened the watch from his wrist and set it down on the counter between them. "I don't need this," Shaq said simply. "Not because I can't afford it, not because I think you're right, but because I want you to know I don't play by your rules." The store was dead silent, employees frozen, security still in place. But the power in the room, it had shifted. Holt opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Shaq took a slow step back. "We're done here," he said calmly. Then, after a beat, a final nail in the coffin, a slow smirk that held nothing but certainty. "For now." Then, without another word, Shaq turned and walked away. Holt didn't call after him, didn't stop him, didn't dare, because this wasn't over. It had just begun. The car ride away from Vanguard Jewelers was silent, but not the kind that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that filled a room after an explosion before the dust had even settled. Shaq sat in the back of his blacked-out Maybach, staring out at the blurred city lights, his mind moving at a relentless speed. Everything about the situation reeked of orchestration. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. This was designed. Grayson Holt had played his part well, calm, composed, and disturbingly confident. Too confident. The way he had smirked, the way he had stalled, the way he had delivered that final line. "Some things are bigger than money, Mr. Hunter." It wasn't just arrogance, it was a message. But from whom? The phone in Shaq's hand vibrated. He didn't even glance at the screen before answering. Jackson Carter, his assistant and the man responsible for ensuring nothing like this should ever happen to him, was already speaking before Shaq could say a word. They scrubbed the transaction logs. That's why Holt was so smug. Jackson's voice was clipped, urgent, the sound of someone working multiple angles at once. "They made it look like you never paid for the watch, but that's not even the worst part." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Go on." "The refund wasn't random. A third-party account wired money to Vanguard Jewelers this morning, covering the returned purchase." Jackson's keyboard clattered in the background as he spoke. "They made it look like you changed your mind about the watch. But it was never about the watch, Shaq." Shaq exhaled slowly, leaning his head back against the leather seat, processing. Someone had gone out of their way not just to accuse him of theft, but to make it look like he had orchestrated it himself. This wasn't about money. This was about something bigger: credibility, power, reputation. "Who owns the account?" Shaq asked, his tone flat, controlled. Jackson let out a humorless chuckle. "Now, that's where it gets fun. The account is registered to a shell corporation out of the Cayman Islands. No real name, no paper trail. But here's the thing. Whoever's behind it, they have access to some serious financial back channels. You don't just fake a wire transfer that cleanly without influence." Shaq's fingers tapped against the armrest of his seat. Slow, deliberate. Influence. That meant someone at a high level had moved these pieces. A competitor? A government entity? Someone from his past? The who mattered less than the why at this moment. Shaq closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the pieces on the board. Vanguard Jewelers wasn't the target. The watch wasn't the target. He was. And this wasn't about today. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to land a headline scandal. They were laying the foundation for something bigger. "Jackson," Shaq said, voice calm but firm, "I want you to find the first ripple. Every move leaves a shadow, no matter how well they cover their tracks. Find the connection between that shell account and someone real." Jackson hesitated. "That might take time." Shaq opened his eyes, looking out at the city passing by in a blur of neon lights. "You have 24 hours. A pause. Then Jackson exhaled. "I'll call you when I have something." The line went dead. Shaq tossed his phone onto the seat beside him and stared out the window. He had spent years building his reputation, carefully crafting the kind of empire that couldn't be touched. He knew how to play the game better than most, knew how to control narratives before they controlled him. Whoever was coming for him now, they were playing for something bigger than just humiliation. The next morning, Shaq sat in his private office, a sleek, glass-walled space that overlooked the New York skyline, sipping black coffee as the pieces of the puzzle began shifting into place. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the city below, but his mind was anything but. Jackson walked in, carrying a tablet, his expression tight. "I found the first ripple," he said, setting the tablet on Shaq's desk. Shaq took it without a word, his eyes scanning the screen. The data in front of him was clean, too clean, except for one overlooked detail. The shell company that had refunded the money to Vanguard Jewelers? It was linked to a financial firm, Sterling Global Holdings. Shaq set the tablet down, his fingers steepled. Sterling Global. That name wasn't just familiar, it was personal. 12 months ago, Shaq had single-handedly outmaneuvered Sterling Global in a high-profile acquisition deal, a corporate takeover that left their CEO, Vincent Holloway, humiliated and desperate for a win. Was this revenge? Shaq's instincts said no. Holloway had resources, but he wasn't the kind of man to play long, strategic games. He was reactionary, emotional. This move? It was surgical, precise. Someone else was using Sterling Global as a front. Jackson watched him carefully. "What's the move?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "We make them think they're winning." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "How do we do that?" Shaq's lips curled into a faint smirk. "We play the game on their terms, for now." He tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind shifting into the long game. Holt had been a pawn, not a player. That much was clear now. He was too composed, too willing to take the heat. That meant he wasn't acting on his own ambition. He was following orders. But orders from who? That was what Shaq needed to uncover. And the best way to do that? Make the people in the shadows believe he was 2 steps behind, when in reality, he was already 3 steps ahead. That evening, a quiet but deliberate meeting took place in the back of an exclusive restaurant in Manhattan. The kind of place where deals were made over $100 steaks and vintage wine. Grayson Holt sat across from a man in a gray suit, his face partially obscured by dim lighting. "They didn't press charges," the man in the suit said, voice even. Hunter walked out untouched. Holt exhaled, swirling the whiskey in his glass before taking a slow sip. That was never the point. The man nodded slightly. "But now he's looking for answers." Holt leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Let him. That's exactly what we want." A smirk played on the other man's lips. "Hunter thinks he's ahead." Holt smiled. "And that's the beauty of it. We want him to think that. Because the real move?" He set his glass down, tapping the table lightly. "It's already been made." Across the city, in his penthouse, Big Shaq stared at the skyline, already anticipating his next move. And he had no idea he was walking straight into a trap. Big Shaq had never been one to wait for an attack to land before making his move. The moment the pieces of the setup started to reveal themselves, he knew there was only one way to counter it, not with defense, but with control. By the time he stepped back into Vanguard Jewelers' VIP lounge, he had already launched a full-scale forensic audit into the store's financial records. He didn't rely on his legal team alone. He had hired a private forensic team, specialists in uncovering digital footprints that weren't meant to be found. If there was a trail, they'd expose it. And if someone thought they had erased their tracks, they underestimated who they were dealing with. The VIP lounge was exactly as he had left it, pristine, curated, designed for the elite. But now, instead of an air of exclusivity, the room felt more like a carefully crafted stage for manipulation. The polished mahogany table, the neatly arranged glasses of imported water, the dimmed lighting, it was all an illusion of civility. And in the center of it all stood Grayson Holt, still calm, still composed, still wearing that infuriatingly confident smirk that suggested he was holding a royal flush. Shaq didn't sit. He didn't offer small talk. He simply stood across the table from Holt, his presence alone shifting the gravity of the room. The store manager was good, but Shaq was better. "You came back," Holt said, his voice smooth, as if this was nothing more than a business negotiation. Shaq exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Holt chuckled, shaking his head. "I was counting on it." The words didn't sit right. It wasn't just the arrogance. It was the certainty. Shaq placed his phone on the table between them, screen up, revealing a live feed of digital transaction records, specifically the one Vanguard Jewelers had altered. "I have a team working through every financial move made in this store over the last month," Shaq said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Turns out someone manually reversed my payment. Not an automatic refund, not a system error, a deliberate move." Holt leaned back slightly, but the smirk remained. "That's quite the accusation." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "It's not an accusation. It's a fact." Holt studied him for a moment, then let out a low, amused chuckle. "And you think proving it will change anything?" Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the polished surface of the table. There it was. The game beneath the game. This was never about the watch. Never about the store. This was about perception, control, public damage. Holt leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to feel like a whisper in the charged air. "You think this is about proving the truth?" It never was. Shaq had expected pushback, expected denials. What he hadn't expected was outright admission. For the first time since this began, he felt something different settle over him. Not just calculated anger, but something colder. Holt wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to make a statement. Shaq inhaled slowly, pressing his palms flat against the table. "So, tell me, Holt, if this was never about proving the truth, what is it about?" Holt's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. "It's about what happens next." Shaq held his gaze, unblinking, waiting. There was more. Holt's fingers drummed lightly against the table. "See, the beauty of a public scandal isn't in whether it's true or not. It's in how long it lasts. A story like this? It lives longer than the facts." He gestured vaguely toward the phone screen, where Shaq's forensic team was still uncovering data. "You can prove you paid for the watch. You can prove we staged this. Hell, you could walk out of here with an apology and a settlement." Holt's smile turned razor sharp. "But will that undo the damage?" Shaq remained motionless, but inside, the storm was already shifting. This wasn't just a hit job, it was a reputation war. Holt continued, his voice maddeningly casual. "A man like you, powerful, careful, untouchable, how many enemies do you think you've made? How many people want to see you fall?" He exhaled, almost amused. This isn't about a watch, Shaq. It's about planting a question in people's minds." Shaq's jaw tensed slightly, but he said nothing. "Today, it's a watch." Holt tilted his head. "Tomorrow, maybe it's a corporate fraud allegation. Maybe it's a leaked email that never existed. Maybe it's something that sticks." Shaq finally moved, picking up his phone slowly, his grip firm but controlled. "You're not acting alone," he said, his voice low, certain. Holt didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Shaq took a slow step back, never breaking eye contact. "Whoever you're working for," Shaq said evenly, "tell them they should have planned better." Holt let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. That's the problem with men like you. You always assume you're one step ahead. Shaq gave a small, unreadable smile. That's because I usually am. Then, without another word, he turned and left. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The storm hit fast. Shaq had barely left Vanguard Jewelers before the media machine roared to life, its teeth sinking into the scandal with relentless hunger. Billionaire tycoon caught stealing? Big Shaq's luxury watch scandal, entitlement or mistake? Power and privilege. When the rich think the rules don't apply. The headlines weren't just misleading. They were surgical. Designed to do exactly what Holt had promised, plant doubt. Within hours, every major news outlet had picked up the story. It spread like wildfire across social media, gaining traction in ways Shaq's PR team couldn't control. The footage of him in the jewelry store, grainy but conveniently clear enough to capture the tension, was being played on repeat. The video cut off right before the truth could be shown. Every angle was spun against him. Commentators debated whether he had tried to bully the store into handing over something he hadn't paid for. Some speculated that his empire was crumbling and he was growing desperate. Even industry analysts, who should have known better, began questioning whether this was the first sign of bigger financial troubles. Shaq sat in his penthouse office, watching it all unfold. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the New York skyline. But for the first time in his life, the city outside felt like a battlefield closing in on him. His empire, built on precision, control, and calculated moves, was now at the mercy of a lie. His phone hadn't stopped vibrating. Not once. His legal team, his PR strategists, his business associates, everyone wanted a response. But what rattled him most was the silence from certain corners. Some of his investors weren't returning calls. A few of his corporate allies, people who had once practically begged to do business with him, were now keeping their distance. The stock value of his holding company had already taken a 4% hit in pre-market trading. This was more than a PR crisis. This was a targeted strike. Jackson Carter, his right-hand strategist, walked into the office, looking grim. He didn't sit. He didn't waste time with formalities. It's worse than we thought. Shaq's expression didn't change. How bad? Jackson dropped a tablet on the desk. Shaq glanced down. Live Analytics. Shaq Corp's stock was down 6.8% and falling. Jackson folded his arms. We're watching a coordinated move. Someone's feeding this fire. We've traced at least 6 major influencers who started pushing the scandal before the news even broke. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Planted? Jackson nodded. And that's not the worst part. 2 of your key investors are re-evaluating their positions. They're waiting to see if this story sticks. If we don't get ahead of this fast, we're looking at a mass sell-off. Shaq said nothing. The room was silent except for the hum of the city below. Then Jackson spoke again, voice quieter. Holt reached out. Shaq's fingers stopped moving against the desk. His gaze lifted, sharp and cold. He called directly? Number sent a message through an intermediary. Jackson's jaw tightened. Wants to talk, privately. Shaq leaned back in his chair, tapping the armrest with slow precision. Holt had played his part masterfully so far, controlled, deliberate, knowing exactly when to strike. Now he was reaching out, which meant he thought he had the upper hand. Shaq's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Set it up. The meeting took place in a private club, the kind of establishment where deals worth billions were made over glasses of 100-year-old scotch. No cameras, no recordings, just unspoken power plays disguised as conversation. Holt was already seated when Shaq arrived, looking perfectly at home in the dimly lit, wood-paneled lounge. His suit was sharp, his cufflinks gleaming under the low light, his expression a portrait of quiet satisfaction. Shaq didn't bother with pleasantries. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood across the table, towering over Holt, his presence commanding the room without a single word. Holt exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You know, you should really take a seat. This is one of those discussions where it helps to be comfortable. Shaq didn't move. His gaze didn't waver. Holt leaned back, unbothered, sipping his drink. All right, straight to it then. He placed his glass down, turning it slightly between his fingers. You know what I want. Shaq's voice was steady. Say it. Holt smirked. A simple public statement. You admit there was a misunderstanding. Say you made a mistake. That's it. You walk away, and this all goes away. Shaq let the words settle in the air for a long moment. Then, he spoke, voice calm, lethal. You think I don't see the play here? He tilted his head. You think I don't know this has nothing to do with an apology? Holt said nothing, but his smirk didn't fade. Shaq exhaled slowly, stepping closer. I don't need to be liked, Holt. I need to be respected. And a man in my position? If I bow now, I lose everything. Holt took another slow sip of his drink, then placed the glass down carefully. That's the beauty of it, Shaq. You've already lost. Shaq narrowed his eyes. Holt continued, voice smooth. You can fight this. You can even prove it was a setup. But do you really think that's enough? The doubt will always be there. The whispers, the headlines. Every deal you try to close from now on, someone will bring this up. Not because they believe it, but because it's useful. He shrugged. But if you walk away, issue a soft apology, let the story fade, people forget. Your stock stabilizes. Your investors come back. The next headline replaces you. Shaq studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then finally, he let out a quiet chuckle. You actually believe that? Holt's smirk wavered. Believe what? That I'd fold. Shaq stepped forward, placing his hands on the table, leaning in just enough for Holt to feel the weight of his presence. Do you know why I win, Holt? Shaq's voice was low, controlled, deadly. Because I never play the game they expect me to. Holt's fingers tensed slightly against his glass. Shaq straightened, adjusting his suit jacket. So let me make something clear. I'm not giving you a damn thing, not an apology, not a retraction, not a single inch. Holt exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Then you've made your choice. Shaq's lips curved in something almost amused. No, Holt. He turned toward the exit. I've made my next move. As he walked out, he could feel Holt watching him. The game was still in motion. But now, Shaq was about to flip the entire board. The answer was never in the watch. It was never about the accusations, the staged humiliation, or the headlines engineered to paint Big Shaq as a fallen billionaire grasping at control. Those were just distractions, smoke and mirrors hiding the real power play. As Shaq sat in his penthouse office, a quiet storm brewed behind his eyes. The city stretched out below him, a glittering network of power, money, and influence. Somewhere in that maze was the person responsible for orchestrating the most calculated attack on his reputation he had ever faced. And now? Now Shaq had a name. Jackson Carter stood across from him, a tablet in hand, his face sharp with urgency. We found it. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He simply waited. Jackson tapped the screen, rotating it toward Shaq. We traced the money trail. The shell corporation that reversed your payment. It was set up months ago, waiting for the right moment. Sterling Global Holdings was just a tool, a financial puppet. But the real player? He exhaled. It's Donovan Rain. The name settled into the room like a gunshot. For the first time since this entire mess started, Shaq felt something rare, genuine surprise. Donovan Rain, a man who, 5 years ago, had stood at the top of the financial world. A Wall Street kingmaker, untouchable, feared. Until Shaq beat him in a high-stakes corporate takeover that left him with nothing. At the time, Rain had taken it in stride. At least, that's what everyone thought. He disappeared from the public eye, liquidated his remaining assets, and faded into the background. Now, Shaq knew better. Rain never disappeared. He had been waiting. And this? This was his play. Shaq leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him. His mind sharpened, weaving the pieces together. The scandal, the accusations. It was never about proving Shaq guilty. It was about damaging him just enough to create instability. Enough to shake investor confidence. Enough to put his partnerships at risk. But why now? Shaq's voice was calm, but edged with something dangerous. What does Rain want? Jackson's jaw tightened. Control. He swiped across the tablet, pulling up another document. We dug deeper into the investors who started pulling out the second this scandal broke. 2 of them? They've been in talks with a private equity firm over the last few weeks. That firm is owned by Rain. Shaq sat back. There it was. This wasn't about destroying him outright. It was about forcing him into a weakened position. If Shaq lost enough backing, if enough doubt lingered in the air, he'd be forced to make a deal to stabilize his empire. A deal Rain would be waiting to offer. And in one move, he would own the very thing Shaq had built. Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. I should have seen it. Jackson's voice was tight. No one did. Shaq's eyes darkened. I'm not interested in playing defense. Jackson hesitated. Shaq, I don't want to fix this. Shaq's voice was calm, measured, lethal. I want payback. For 5 years, Rain had been plotting this, watching, waiting, calculating the perfect moment to strike. Shaq wasn't going to undo the damage. He was going to burn Rain's entire plan to the ground, and he was going to do it on his own terms. The meeting was set in an undisclosed location, neutral ground, away from boardrooms, cameras, or legal buffers. Donovan Rain had agreed immediately. That alone told Shaq everything he needed to know. Rain was exactly as Shaq remembered, cold, composed, dangerous. He sat in a leather chair, his silver hair slicked back, his charcoal suit immaculate, radiating the quiet arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. Shaq walked in without hesitation, taking the seat across from him, their eyes locking in a silent war before a word was spoken. Rain was the first to break the silence. He smirked slightly, swirling the drink in his hand. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Shaq leaned back, his posture deceptively relaxed. I have to say it's impressive. The long game isn't easy to pull off. But I suppose when you have 5 years to plan, you can get the details right. Rain chuckled, shaking his head. It's not about revenge, Shaq. You think too small. This was always about correction. Shaq arched a brow. Correction? Rain's smirk deepened. You took something from me. I'm simply returning the favor. Shaq tilted his head slightly. You think taking a few investors from me changes anything? He exhaled, almost amused. You're making the same mistake you made 5 years ago. You're underestimating me. Rain's smile didn't fade, but his grip on his glass tightened slightly. A microsecond of tension. Shaq caught it. I don't need you to collapse overnight, Shaq, Rain said smoothly. I just need to make sure you're vulnerable long enough for me to step in. Shaq nodded slowly, his smirk now matching Rain's. Right. And what happens when I don't break? What happens when I flip the script? Rain exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You don't get it, do you? You've already lost. It doesn't matter if the truth comes out. The damage is done. The doubt is planted. And in our world, perception is more powerful than reality. Shaq smiled. See, that's where you're wrong. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and set it face up on the table. Live feed, a media release, already prepared, scheduled to go live within minutes. It wasn't a defensive statement. It wasn't a reputation cleanup. It was a full expose on Donovan Rain, a detailed breakdown of his financial manipulation, his hidden shell corporations, and the fact that he had been moving funds through fraudulent investment firms for months. Shaq had let him believe he was ahead, and now he was about to take his empire apart piece by piece. Rain's smirk finally vanished. Shaq's voice was calm, almost amused. You were right about one thing. He picked up his phone, watching the countdown. 10 seconds until the release went live. In our world, perception is power. 5 seconds. And I'm about to change yours. 3. Rain's jaw clenched. 2. Shaq smirked. Checkmate. 1. And just like that, the game flipped. Big Shaq had never been the kind of man to react impulsively. He didn't lash out, didn't fight battles that weren't worth winning. But when he did strike, he made sure his enemies never recovered. Donovan Rain and Grayson Holt thought they had orchestrated the perfect downfall, a scandal too loud to ignore, a hit to Shaq's reputation that would shake investor confidence, weaken his empire, and force him into a desperate position. They had counted on the weight of public perception, on the fact that in their world, it didn't matter if an accusation was true or false, only that it was believable. But what they hadn't counted on? Shaq flipping the game entirely. He didn't need to beg for his reputation back. He didn't need to play the victim. Instead, he set the board himself and made sure the pieces fell exactly where he wanted them. It started with a calculated leak, a carefully timed, deliberate release of information, not in response to the scandal, but in command of it. Instead of issuing a statement defending himself, he released something far more dangerous: the truth. Within hours, the media had a new headline. Big Shaq set up, new evidence points to financial manipulation behind luxury watch scandal. And this time, the narrative wasn't controlled by his enemies. The proof was undeniable. The financial records were released, showing that the funds for his purchase had indeed been reversed by an external shell company, one linked directly to Sterling Global Holdings. Then came the real blow: a series of confidential emails between Donovan Rain and Grayson Holt. The leaked messages detailed the entire setup: how Holt had been positioned inside Vanguard Jewelers, how the timing of the media coverage had been coordinated to maximize damage, how key investors had been nudged toward pulling out, creating a ripple effect of uncertainty. And then, the most damning message of all: once the stock dips, we make our move. Hunter won't have a choice. The entire play had been exposed. The media, which had been so eager to paint Shaq as an entitled billionaire caught in scandal, pivoted instantly. Who's really behind the attempt to take down Big Shaq? The watch scandal was a setup. Here's who pulled the strings. Corporate warfare at its finest. How Big Shaq outsmarted his enemies. The very outlets that had once tried to bury him were now praising his resilience. The public, once skeptical, now saw him not as a man accused, but as a man targeted. And in business, being seen as a victim of sabotage was far more powerful than a simple denial of wrongdoing. But Shaq wasn't done yet. With the pressure mounting, with Rain's name suddenly trending for all the wrong reasons, the fallout began. Grayson Holt, who had stood so confidently in their last meeting, suddenly wasn't so composed anymore. When the press cornered him outside Vanguard Jewelers, his carefully crafted mask cracked. The reporters were relentless. "Mr. Holt, do you deny your involvement in the conspiracy? Did you knowingly falsify store records to frame Big Shaq? Are you cooperating with authorities?" The last question was the one that mattered. Because by then, Holt knew he had no escape. Shaq hadn't just exposed the game. He had made sure the players turned on each other. With the weight of the evidence crushing him, Holt did what every man in his position would do. He flipped. Within 24 hours, Holt had given up everything. He testified against Rain, providing additional documentation, meeting records, and direct communications that tied him not just to the financial setup, but to a much larger network of market manipulation schemes that had been in play for years. Rain, finished. His investors fled. His credibility was gone. His influence, dismantled. By the time the dust settled, Shaq wasn't just cleared. He was untouchable. The sun hung low over New York as Shaq stepped through the doors of Vanguard Jewelers one final time. This time, there were no security guards blocking his exit, no cameras waiting to capture a scandal, no nervous employees glancing over their shoulders. The store was eerily quiet, the weight of the past few days hanging heavy in the air. And standing near the counter, looking far less confident than before, was Grayson Holt. Shaq approached, his steps slow, deliberate, controlled. Holt met his gaze, but there was no smirk this time, no false confidence, just resignation. Shaq said nothing at first. Instead, he simply reached out, took the Vanguard Orion watch from the counter, and fastened it onto his wrist. The same watch they had tried to use to ruin him. The same watch that, in the end, proved he had won. Only then did he speak, his voice low, calm, and final. "Next time," Shaq said, adjusting the cuff of his suit, "pick a better player for your game." He turned and walked out. The game was over, and he had won. They tried to take him down, but he turned the game against them. Big Shaq exposed the conspiracy, crushed his enemies, and came out stronger than ever. But power plays like this don't go unanswered. Someone bigger was pulling the strings, and now Shaq is ready to hunt. Stay tuned, because the real battle is just beginning.